Ladies, braves, and gentlemen, welcome to part one of the three-part series featuring the giant Chief King Tuscaloosa right here on American soil, Alabama, House Hill, Dark Enlightenment. Let's go. We're going to begin our journey, our discovery of the Chief King Tuscaloosa, the giant King Chief Tuscaloosa, at the Library of Congress, where this document is held. As you can see, it has the stamp of the Library of Congress. And we go on to the document, reading, Tuscaloosa, the origins of its name, its history, etc. A paper read before the Alabama Historical Society by Thomas Maxwell, July 1st, 1870. Now notice the date, 1870. He's speaking from the aspect of that time in history. We have a map of De Soto's route from Tampa Bay to the Mississippi River. This is America, ladies and gentlemen. These are the regions in which they are saying Chief Tuscaloosa and other Indian nations were. Keep in mind that the Black Warrior River is named after Chief Tuscaloosa. So I would come to the conclusion that he was ebony, that he was of a dark complexion, if it's called the Black Warrior River, and the Black Warrior is Chief King Tuscaloosa. And the author starts the paper. Ladies and gentlemen, the responsibility of my appearing before this audience must rest upon my fellow members of the Alabama Historical Society, who, by vote of their body in July last, request that I would prepare a paper to read at their next annual meeting on Tuscaloosa, the origins of the name, its history, etc. He goes on to say, a contrast exists between ourselves in this respect and the people of the New England states, where every child is taught from his cradle that he must go annually, in idea at least, on a pilgrimage to the Blarney Stone of Plymouth Rock and lick it in order to imbibe new and fresh historic inspiration about the greatness and glory of his forefathers. The greatness and glory.
Our forefathers weren't the pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
And we're going to go on and we're going to see if we read about greatness and glory in respect to the forefathers. And when he says his forefathers, the Spanish were actually the first explorers. So if he's speaking of the Spanish being his forefathers instead of the pilgrims, which came on a religious retreat from authority and then begin their mission of a religious takeover. They didn't beat the Indians with guns. They beat them with Bibles. And he goes on to say, without wishing to detract in the least degree from the importance of that event to mankind at large, and admitting that the landing of the pilgrims was a great event, having its place in the history of the early settlement of North America by the whites, I must be permitted to say that in point of time, their landing must occupy a subordinate place on the score of antiquity when compared with other great events which took place within a few miles of where we now stand. Now he makes it clear that he is speaking of De Soto and the other Spanish explorers that came before him. So he's saying that the Pilgrim's Landing is subordinate to the initial barbaric meeting between white men, Spanish, which were not actually white. After his preliminary remarks, he goes on to say, Tuscaloosa, the origins of its name, its history, etc., With this extent, we will take a brief review of the wonderful expedition of Hernando de Soto through the wilderness of Georgia, Florida, and Alabama in 1539 and 40, reviewed as the entering wedge and preparatory step in the Southwest to reduce this immense territory to the uses of our present civilization. In this conclusion to his preliminary remarks, he says that Hernando de Soto's mission was wonderful. His expedition was wonderful. And we're going to go on and read and see just how wonderful it was for the indigenous people that were already there. And this paper is written, is documented from 1539 to 40. These are the years of the documented expedition. He will refer to the gentleman that wrote these manuscripts. For the facts and dates introduced, I am indebted to the Portuguese gentleman who accompanied De Soto through his entire expedition. The work was first issued in 1557, and the first English edition was published by Hakluyt in 1609. Also to a Spanish work by the Enir Garcilasco de la Vega, published in 1603, which the author wrote down from the lips of 3 cavaliers of worth and respectability, who accompanied De Soto, translated by Theodore Irving in 1835. So you see here we have a translation that occurred. When you have translations, you have things taken out, you have things put back in, you have things switched up, you have people having their biases, wanting the manuscript to say certain things in certain ways. So they will omit things, they will add things to gain favor of the audience of that present day. These manuscripts may have been tampered with, yet the truth, some of the truth, couldn't be erased. They couldn't tamper with the document enough to erase the history totally.
Subscribe to my channel.
Mr. Irving, having carefully compared the Spanish and Portuguese authors, and where slight differences seem to exist, having brought them into harmony when practicable. I have mainly relied on his authority. Okay? So he relied on the authority of Theodore Irving from 1835 rather than the actual manuscript published in 1605, 1609, and even as early as the first work in 1557.
What?
He refers to a manuscript from almost 300 years later, after 3 different publishings, translations, and as he says here, and where slight differences seem to exist, having brought them into harmony when practicable. In his opening chapter on the conquest of Florida, this was a conquest, ladies and gentlemen. This was a mission to destroy, kill, rape, whatever you had to do to conquer. So these were not wonderful expeditions of great men. These were conquering barbarians coming to another man's land and taking it over. The indigenous people owned the land. It was that man's land. And he goes on to say, never was the spirit of wild adventure more universally diffused than at the dawn of the 16th century. The wondrous discoveries of Columbus and his hardy companions and followers, the description of the beautiful isles of the West, and the tales of the unexplored regions of wealth locked up in the unbound wilderness. All materialistic greed is what we hear. We're gonna see just how wonderful these expeditions were. And he goes on to talk about the discoverers' barbaric acts in terms of such valiantry and glory. And he goes on to say, of all the enterprises undertaken in the spirit of daring adventure, none has surpassed for hardihood and variety of incident than that of the renowned Hernando de Soto and his band of cavaliers. It was poetry put in action. It was knight errantry of the old world carried into the depths of the American wilderness. Indeed, the personal adventures, the feats of individual prowess, the picturesque descriptions of the steel-clad cavaliers with the lance and helm and prancing steed glittering through the wilderness of Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, and the prairies of the far west would be to us mere fictions of romance. Did they not come to us recorded in matter-of-fact narratives of contemporaries and corroborated by minute and daily memoranda of eyewitnesses? Eyewitnesses who I may say have no link to the indigenous people. Therefore, they would write what they wanted in terms of what they wanted it to say. Continuing on, those conversing with the history of the Spanish discoveries will remember of the brave old governor of Puerto Rico, Ponce de Leon, in the search for the fountain of youth. This fabled fountain, according to Indian traditions, existed in one of the Bahama Islands. Ponce de Leon sought for it in vain, but in the course of his cruisings, he discovered a country of vast and unknown extent, and from the abundance of flowers along its coast, he named it Florida, or the land of flowers. Obtaining permission from the Spanish governor to subjugate and govern the country in the year 1512, he made a second voyage to its shores, but in a conflict with the natives, he was mortally wounded, and his expedition was a failure. Several other expeditions were fitted out who landed at different points, but because of the barbarous treatment of the natives, they were all equally unsuccessful. One was of considerable proportions, consisting of 400 men and 45 horses, who landed April 12, 1528. But after incredible hardships, this also was destroyed, and only 5 survivors made their way across the country to Mexico. So you see here, there were 400 men here, and only 5 made it out. So the Indians, the indigenous Indians, were not having it. They were killing all of these expeditions who he claimed they ran into hardships, so it was a failure. I wonder what hardships they ran into. Could have been bows and arrows and spears from the native indigenous Americans. On May 25th, 1539, the largest and best appointed expedition arrived on the coast of Florida opposite Tampa Bay under command of Hernando de Soto. Fire signals appeared along the coast, showing that the natives had taken the alarm and were summoning their warriors to assemble. Several days were required to sound the harbor, and great caution was used about landing. That's because there were actual coral reefs in those days before the coral reefs were destroyed on the coast of America, which prevented all explorers from landing. You would risk destroying your sailboat with the reefs. So the reefs were eliminated. A detachment of 300 men were landed and took former possession in the name of Charles of Spain. Towards dawn, however, an immense number of savages, and every time they refer to the indigenous people as savages, we will replace that with indigenous people, just to let you know what they thought of the indigenous, the original people, the original inhabitants of this continent, the so-called black people, the now called African Americans, were the indigenous Indians that we're speaking of, De Soto and Charles V of Spain conquering. And we continue. An immense number of indigenous people broke upon them with deafening yells, and in panic the Spaniards retreated to the edge of the sea. After a furious charge of cavalry, however, the Indians fled. Now they're Indians. Next day, the remainder of the troops were disembarked, and the Spaniards took possession of the first deserted village they had seen. The houses were built of wood and thatched with palm leaves. Now you hear what they said? Not huts, not teepees, wood. The houses were built of wood. So we had actual construction going on here. Artisans, wood artisans that constructed actual buildings. At one end of the village stood a temple with the image of a bird on top, made of wood and gilded eyes. Within the temple were found strings of pearls. De Soto at length succeeded in capturing a few straggling Indians, from whom he learned that the Narvaez expedition had been there and had treated the natives with gross barbarity, and that there was one man belonging to the Narvaez expedition still living in the country, under the protection of a neighboring chief named Mukuzo, and whose life had been spared by the principal chief Harihigua at the intercession of his daughter. Yet, notwithstanding this act of grace, Harihigua, burning with resentment at the conduct of the men who had been with Narvaez, would permit no intercourse between his people and De Soto. De Soto now learned how barbarously Narvaez and his men had treated Harihigua, that after being hospitably received by the chief and his family, for some unknown reason, barbarity, he had ordered the chief's nose to be cut off and his mother to be torn to pieces by dogs. Of course, it is no wonder that Harihigua found another invasion of the same Christian race upon his shores. He should repel every effort of De Soto in reconciliation with a scorn which demanded no intercourse but that of war, with extermination for its basis. And his policy he succeeded in inducing all the neighboring chiefs to adopt, except Mukuzo, with whom De Soto was on amicable terms by reason of his kindness and protecting Juan Ortiz from sacrifice during his 12 years captivity, so that at every step as he advanced into the interior of the country, he was met by the most determined resistance and opposition, not only by Harihigua, but by the allied chiefs of the adjoining provinces of the Aribaracaxi, Acura, Ocali, Vatichua, Vatichuco, Asachile, and Hia, the latter being the principal town of the great province of Appalachee. And you can see how these initial explorers treated the indigenous people after being received with hospitality. We were not a warlike people. We would defend what was ours, but as you can see, they had the armor, they had the cannons, they had the steel weaponry, and so they defended themselves as we defended ourselves. But the difference is they were the conquerors, and you can see the barbarity and why. The Indian and the white man were at constant war. The foundation of what happened when the Spanish arrived. They cut the chief's nose off and had his mother torn to pieces by dogs. This is the glory you speak of, Thomas? These are the valiant expeditions you speak of? The great expeditions of the people before the pilgrims that you speak of? This is what you speak of that was so great and glorious? Wow. As you continue to read, I'll just say, he speaks of attack after attack on the Spaniards and them being scalped, their scalps being taken as trinkets of reward for war by the indigenous Indians. Suffice it to say that never in the history of knight errantry, not even by the undoubted Don Quixote himself, was there such a display of reckless bravery as for 6 months was the daily life of this wonderful expedition. How wonderful it was. And on the way, don't forget he mentioned that De Soto kidnapped straggling Indians. He just taking people along the way. But this is so wonderful. After he would kidnap these straggling indigenous Indians, he would make them slaves. He'd make them serve the army. So just how wonderful is this expedition, Thomas? Though utterly decimated and exhausted by conflicts with savages, indigenous people, both day and night for 5 months, internal vigilance being required to keep his forces from being decimated by the Indians, who never missed an opportunity to take advantage of any want of caution. The Appalachians were a race of large stature and amazing vigor of arm and intrepidity of spirit. And if small parties of Spaniards repaired to the forest to cut wood, the sound of their axes was a signal for a host of concealed savages, indigenous Indians, to surround and slay them, break off the chains of the Indian prisoners who had brought to carry wood for fuel, and bear off the scalps of the slain as trophies. In going out foraging for maize, the same result was of frequent occurrence. Such was the fertility of the province of Appalachee. However, in the quantity of maize, beans, pumpkins, and other grains and fruits so abundant that there was no need of foraging more than a league and a half around the encampment or town, which was well fortified to obtain food in abundance for 1,500 persons, including Indians, and above 300 horses. When they say the land of milk and honey, they knew they had reached the place. They were in the land of milk and honey, and they wanted it. And they were willing to kill every Indian in sight to continue to find gold, treasure, to take it back to the king to say, hey, we need to come back over here and take this place over, because our place, it is not hitting like that. We need to get out of here. So here they come, killing off the so-called savages. He has the nerve to call these people savages. And we've read so far what's been done. They are invading the people's land, they received hospitably, then they kill the people, maim them, kill their relatives, their mothers, their fathers, their kids. It's despicable. De Soto continued to inquire about getting to treasure. 2 Indian lads were brought to him, about 16 years of age, natives of distant provinces who had traveled with Indian traders. They offered to guide him to those provinces. So we have 2 traders They see these men. They see their intentions. I don't know if they were captured and scared, but they offered to guide him. That's highly unlikely. I think once again, De Soto captured them, probably threatened their lives. Either you die or you tell me where I need to go. And they proceeded to tell him. I don't think they were the traitors that Thomas is making them out to be. Here you have history being told in a way as to appease a certain audience of readers or listeners. Once again, it's despicable. They said these two Indians were enticed by gold pieces, ring sets, pearls, precious stones, and as if any of these were in Cofachiqui. He gave them no doubt a vague and blundering reply, which they interpreted according to their wishes. They understood him that the chief traffic in that province was in these yellow and white metals, and that pearls were to be found in abundance. It was therefore determined that the army should march in search of Cofachiqui. So, greed, led by greed. First the fountain of youth, now we're searching for these gold and silver metals. In 1540, this is in the 1500s, ladies and gentlemen, De Soto broke up his winter cantonment and conceded to the northeast. The Indians that they captured and made servants, being exposed naked and in irons during the severe cold weather, had nearly all perished, so that each soldier would be obliged to carry his supply on his back. And that's good for those soldiers. You had these people exposed naked in irons during severe cold. They died on this glorious expedition. Wasn't so glorious for the indigenous Indians, was it? Keep in mind, you're invading their land. And they continue to speak about how he marches on to find Cofachiqui. And finally, they had crossed the bog and a strip of thicket about 20 paces, which was an opening country with cornfields. Now, do you hear that? The Indians had cornfields. The indigenous Indians made corn bread, which is now an American staple. They got all of these recipes from the indigenous Indians because corn was our main crop. When the Indians saw any Spaniards that were not clad in iron and upon horses, and they were just man to man, as an indigenous Indian would be, just with his loincloth on, they knew they could take them. The only thing that separated them was this metal, the accoutrements of war, the wardrobe of war is what the Indians lacked. Every village they came into, you hear, the Indians fled to the forest with their wives, children, and effects. The horsemen dashing into the village, two of whom were warriors that had remained behind to remove the infirm. So you see the mind state of the indigenous Indian. He's removing his children, his wives. He's staying back to remove the infirm, the sick. They came into De Soto's presence with a fearless and lofty demeanor and demanded, "What seek ye in our land, war or peace?" I don't know if he's saying they were speaking English, but once again, we see the Indians knew English. What seek ye in our land, peace or war? De Soto replied through his interpreter, "We seek not war, but peace." So the English was being spoken by the Indians, and De Soto was a Spanishman, so he spoke Spanish. So he needed an interpreter, not the Indians. De Soto replies to him, "We are in search of a distant province, and all we ask is food by the road." So they had to feed De Soto to conquer them. That's how much they desired peace. That's how much they did not want their people to die. They just gave him the food and made peaceful arrangements. And De Soto stayed there for 3 days and resumed its march northeast. Here we have Thomas, author of this speech, talking about how De Soto left a cannon with the Kafakwe of Kofa. But it's irrelevant that he left a cannon, because he kidnapped, killed the people, conquered them, and then conqueror's history. We don't care that De Soto left a cannon. We read he only left it because it was so cumbersome to carry. He left the cannon, and they are so enamored with the fact that this cannon was left with the indigenous Indians. Who gives a damn? You can see here, he's still speaking of this cannon that we don't give a damn about. This is near where I stay. It was found between the mouth of Hatchet Creek and Wetumpka on the Coosa River. He described it as being of brass and blah, blah, blah. We are in the actual place where major events in the conquering of the indigenous Indian, the Negroid phenotype that they speak of. These indigenous Indians, the Black Warrior River, the Black Warrior, times in history when the land was actually taken by force. And then afterwards came the missionaries, the pilgrims. After they saw they could not quite overcome the might of the indigenous Indian with force, then came the Bible, the King tames. The Bible which was made to tame the kings of the New World.
Look at the image though. Foreigners coming by sailboats. Look at how they portrayed the Indians already on their land. You think we were welcoming them with open arms? Look what he got in his hand. He got the Bible in his hand, don't he? The cross right here. That's one of their logos, by the way. But yeah, a lot of people were involved in that. King William, Society for Propagating the Gospel in Foreign Parts. You had Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. Thomas Bray, the United Society for Propagating the Gospel. That was another one. All of this stuff came from the Church of England. But Dane, are you telling us that it came from a church? Yeah, but Dane, who was in charge of the church? Wait a minute, I'm getting there. Give him this.
Make sure you join us next week when we'll continue our 3-part series with part 2 of the giant American Indian Chief King Tuscaloosa. Ladies, braves, and gentlemen, till then, peace.